Basically, if we removed every single human from the face of this earth, not very much would change. The earth would get along just fine. Pretty much all animals, except a few domesticated ones that we've trained to be useless, would be perfectly fine. If we removed all the insects, everything would be gone pretty much within a few hours. Definitely within a few months, we would absolutely collapse. There would be no, the entire ecosystems utterly depend on insects.
My guest this week is Darragh Ennis. Now, you might know him as the Menace on ITV's The Chase. However, what you may not know is that he's an entomologist and neuroscientist with a bachelor's and PhD in biology and ecology from Maynooth University, and currently he works as a research associate at the University of Glasgow in the Davis Lab. Darragh, welcome to STEM with Mr. N.
Thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And can we just start with, I mentioned two big words there in the introduction about what you do. So first, we're going to start with what those are. Firstly, what is entomology?
Well, entomology is the study of things with six legs, study of insects. So I've worked with several different insects over the years for various different reasons. Sometimes I was trying to kill the insects, actually, because we used to try to control insect pests. And then for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on fruit flies and trying to understand how their brains work. So yeah, it's not classical entomology. I'm not going out in the Amazon trying to find new species or anything, but I've worked with insects for over 20 years. And then, and neuroscience obviously is merged into the two of those, is studying the nervous system. So I use insects as a model to study the nervous system.
And you mentioned in there that you started off first trying to kill insects and control insects. But I know that right now there's a big thing going on, and especially in the book behind me, Silent Earth, where it's talking about the decline in insect population. What sort of impact is declining insect population having on the earth, and why are entomologists important in studying that and trying to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, it's a huge problem. Basically, if we removed every single human from the face of this earth, not very much would change. The earth would get along just fine. Pretty much all animals, except a few domesticated ones that we've trained to be useless, would be perfectly fine. If we removed all the insects, everything would be gone pretty much within a few hours. Definitely within a few months, we would absolutely collapse. There would be no, the entire ecosystems utterly depend on insects. The food that we eat is pollinated by it. Lots of animals eat insects. Insects are very important in recycling nutrients and breaking things down. They're a huge part of life on Earth, and they're way more important than us, to be honest. So yeah, it's absolutely vital that we keep them going.
And obviously, we were talking as well about the fact that you were studying their brains and combining the insects and neuroscience. Which one for you came first? Were you an entomologist first who moved towards neuroscience, or were you the other way around?
Oh, definitely entomologist first. So I did like my PhD and things on insects. So I was studying insects in forests in Ireland, and I did something similar in Canada for a while. I was there for 3 years. But when I moved to Oxford, I applied to an insect lab because I knew insects, not because I knew neuroscience. But luckily, my boss, Elan, well, he hates boss, the lab head, Elan, was always interested in people's skills and transferables. So he saw skills that I could use in his lab that other people didn't have. So even though I wasn't much of a neuroscientist at all, like never really studied it, and they did very advanced microscopy in our lab. We did. I wasn't much of a microscopist either, but I had other skills to do with insects, insect behavior, and all that kind of thing. So I moved from insect ecology into neuroscience, definitely.
And there's a couple of things in there that I want to pick up on, because there's a lot of big words coming out, that just to make sure people know what they are. So you said that you're not a microscopist, which I had to think about that to make sure I got my mouth around it correctly.
The lab that in the Davis lab, the technology that we use very often, we use lots of different technologies. It's really advanced microscopes, because we're studying, things that are so small, 10,000 times thinner than a human hair, single molecules at a time, and using really cutting edge techniques to look at the nervous system intact and find out what's happening on a subcellular level, so smaller than a cell, so single molecules or small groups of molecules at a time. So that was well beyond my skill set when I joined the lab. But they were brilliant at it. And Richard, the senior researcher in the lab who'd been there for years, was an amazing teacher. So I was very quickly picked it up.
And there was something else that I'd read in your research, which you haven't mentioned, but when mentioned about looking at the neuroscience and the different insects,
Mm.
mentioned that you were looking at RNA.
Yes.
And why I want to bring that up is recently people have heard a lot about RNA with
Mm.
COVID-19, but there's a bit of confusion about what RNA is. So could you just say a wee bit about what RNA is?
Yeah, well, RNA, we like to talk about this as the most neglected molecule in science. Everybody talks about DNA and everybody knows what it is, that big double helix shape. But RNA is a single strand, so it's not double. And the ones we were looking at specifically were messenger RNAs. So if you think about your DNA as being a recipe book on how to make a human, so there's 20 something thousand genes, so each gene is a page, and those genes actually are instructions to make proteins. That's what they are. So to do that, your cell doesn't move the DNA molecule around because it's way too big. It's like 2 meters long in humans, which in cellular terms is absolutely immense. So it cuts out a single copy of the piece that it needs, the one recipe that it needs, and copies it. And that copy is a messenger RNA. And we were studying those because they get moved around the cell quite a lot and they have huge impacts on how cells operate, how they grow, how they shrink, and all the different things that they do. So those single molecules, those tiny little fractions of DNA, copies of bits of DNA, are what we're interested in.
And now that we've managed to go through a lot of that, I'm going to tie it together into one thing which is important. And I don't know why I've never asked any of my guests this question about science, but you'd mentioned you were in insect ecology, then you were in looking at the neuroscience and microscopy and all of these different bits and tiny strands of RNA. So how important is it to have a growth mindset when you're working in science? Because it sounds like you've had to keep trying new things and picking up new things.
Oh, absolutely. You go very stale very quickly and you get set in your ways and you don't pick up new techniques. If you do the same thing over and over again, you become an expert at it. But if you become an expert in one thing and nothing else, that's not useful in science most of the time. You really want to be able to understand better how the whole systems work together. And the old classification of, oh, I'm a chemist, I'm a biologist, I'm a physicist, that doesn't really apply anymore. In our lab, we employed engineers. Richard, the guy I was talking about, he was a botanist, he was a plant biologist, So we employed mathematicians, we worked with computer scientists, we even worked with people who, were involved in things like astronomy and stuff. So you blend any skills together and a multifunctional approach, a different with lots of different methods is far better at understanding the whole system than trying to just pick out one tiny little way of doing it. It's much better to work together.
And it's interesting to hear that so many different backgrounds can all come together in the one lab to focus on the one thing. And
Mm.
since I'm saying there about backgrounds, that's a good time to actually find out a bit about your background. Where did your interest in STEM come from?
So I have been a nerd for as long as I can remember. I was never any good at sports. I always wanted to be good at sports, but I was never any good at them, anything like that. But I remember maybe being about 9 or 10 years old and being asked what I wanted to do for a living, and I wanted to be a marine biologist. So I actually came pretty close. So a lot of kids say, they want to be whatever they want to be when they grow up, and they never do anything like it. But I actually came very, very close. I was always fascinated by how things work. I had a book when I was a kid called Tell Me Why, which my aunt bought me because she'd been looking after me for a few days while my parents were away, and I basically just peppered her with questions all the time. And asking questions is what a scientist is. So
So,
yeah, I was always going this way, to be honest.
yeah, and it sounds like you were always naturally curious.
Mm,
And as you said, you kind of followed that route and went into science anyway. But something you mentioned there about your aunt buying you a book brings me
mm.
nicely round to something else I was going to ask you about, which is your upcoming book on
Oh yeah,
the human body, 10 Things You Should Know About,
yeah,
which is due for release on the 26th of September, if I've got it right.
yes, that's right.
My
Yeah.
my copy is already on pre-order.
Oh, amazing.
So I've got the rest of the series. So when I saw that was coming out, I was like, I need to get that one as well. But obviously, we were speaking about you wanted to be a marine biologist. You went into entomology. Why did you write about the human body for your things you should know about?
Well, normally I could come up with some wonderful reason that I was sitting cogitating on the human body, but it's not that at all. I was contacted by a publisher asking, would I like to write the book? So there is a series, as you know, you've read the other ones, and they're great, actually. I've read them all now as well. So they're nice, short books in normal people's terms, so anybody can understand them about big subjects in biology and science, which is great. So I really liked them, and they said, we want to do the body this time. Would you write it, seeing as you're a biologist? And I just said yes. I thought it was a great idea. Having read the other ones, I was going, oh, this is a brilliant series to do. So yeah, I didn't pick the topic, but it's a topic that I knew a lot about and was very happy to write about.
Yeah. And how much of that knowledge came through when you were studying? So I'd mentioned obviously you've got your bachelor's and PhD in biology and ecology. At
Hmm.
what point do you start to specialize through that study and decide I'm going to focus on entomology, or how much of that did you have general biology of the animal kingdom?
So I did a general degree in Maynooth, so which is a university in Ireland, and I did physics. Didn't do physics. I did chemistry. I did computer science. I did maths, and I did biology. And I specialized in biology by fourth year. So I was an undergrad fourth year doing biology, and part of that was a very large part of that year was a project in a lab, so in a proper research lab, and I did mine in the ecology lab. So it was that point when I really started to specialize. But up until that point, I did very, very wide ranging sort of modules and topics in biology. So I have a very good understanding of general level biology. I am in no way an expert on the human body. That is not my thing, but I am quite a good scientist and I'm a good biologist. So for a layperson's book like this, it was relatively okay. I still had to do a lot of fact checking. And some of the chapters I got friends of mine to read just to make sure I didn't say anything silly because I did my undergrad degree sort of 20 odd years ago, and I just wanted to make sure that things hadn't moved on because things move on in science, or that I was misremembering something. I did quite a lot of research. I fact checked a lot, and I got real experts to just double check any crazy wild claims that I made.
No, it's great in these answers that we're finding out so much about how interdisciplinary things have been. Like when you're saying there about your degree, all the different parts that you did before specializing, and
Mm.
then being able to pick up knowledge and to transfer the skills from one scientific discipline to another. There's lots of great things coming out that shows that you don't need to have a specific focus to begin with, and you can follow down different paths.
Yeah, the only reason why you become fixed in a path is if you're rigid yourself. So if you are mentally rigid, if you're not curious and you're not open-minded to new things and to trying new things and working in new different ways and learning new methods, you decide, you make that decision. So if you become pigeonholed, that's kind of down to you. If you're open and curious and you work in like a real research environment, you kind of have to. You just embrace it. Now, I'm terrible at some of it. I'm really bad at coding. I never picked up programming at all. Just my brain doesn't work that way. Never really liked it, but I did what I had to do. But yeah, things like optics and mathematics of how microscopes work at a deep level would not have been my thing at all when I was an undergrad. But now it's fine. You just pick it up.
And I had a guest on recently who said that she was told when she was younger that she shouldn't pursue science. It wasn't for her at all. Do you think there is any room in science for only certain types of people, or do you think science is such a broad spectrum that it is actually welcoming to everybody?
I think that there is room for everybody as long as you're curious about how things work. That you have to ask questions. So one of the rules in my lab when you were giving a presentation was within the first minute or so, you had to ask a question with a question mark, an actual question. That had to be one of your slides on a presentation. What is the question you're addressing? And if you're not doing that, you're just kind of tinkering and stuff. It was so if you're curious, if you're asking questions that nobody else knows the answer to, then you can be a scientist. I think some disciplines are probably, if you want to do advanced physics, but you're terrible at maths, that might be a struggle for you. But you could always do something else. There's always room. It's literally the entire universe to study. There's always room for different skills.
Yeah, and that's great because I think that's a terrible thing to tell anybody about any discipline really that they shouldn't try and pursue it.
Now,
Um,
that said, I should not be a dancer because that's never going to but but for science, yeah, you can always different people bring different skills. And it can be artistic as well. I know someone who did some work for us, and she does scientific animations and drawings, and she's got a company doing that. And it's brilliant. It's really useful for most scientists. Are not very artistic at all. We're mostly sort of analytical and stuff, but she was brilliant at it and was able to do these cool animations for us. That's not a classical scientific skill, but it's useful in science.
Did you have any STEM heroes when you were growing up, or even when you were already on your path into entomology?
Oh, David Attenborough. David Attenborough was my hero. I don't queue for anything. I am a really impatient person. I don't like queues. And I queued for 4 hours with my pregnant wife to get my book signed by him in Oxford like years and years ago. And I don't regret. I only got to talk to him for about 10 seconds, and it was worth every minute of waiting. So he was definitely my hero. And I want to be him. I still want to be him. I want to do, I'd love to do scientific programming like he did. But in terms of, lab scientists and stuff, not so much. I think those people are not really, unless you talk about like the major inventors, like, Fleming inventing penicillin, or not inventing, discovering penicillin and all that kind of thing. They're not really mainstream names, which is kind of tragic, to be honest. A little kid, you ask them to name a famous scientist, they might know Einstein, but that'd be about it.
No, I agree with you. So last year I did a series of videos on 100 scientists who influenced the world for that reason. Folk like Fleming, Jane Goodall, and various
Yeah.
others who are not well known. But I think David Attenborough has been key for a lot of people, and still is, given the fact he's still going strong.
Yeah.
Um,
I know that, like, there's some people who change word, like Norman Borlaug. You know who he is?
no, not a name I'm familiar with.
No, nobody does, and he's probably saved more human lives than any other individual in the entire history of humanity. He and his lab were the ones who developed the strains of rice and wheat that we use nowadays. So the massive agricultural revolution in, I think, the 50s and 60s is largely down to him. He won like Congressional Medal of Honor and all this kind of stuff, but nobody knows who he is, and he's literally saved billions of lives.
Well, that's tragic, and I'm glad we've managed to give him a platform now
Yeah.
to have people to hear a bit about him. And something else that I'd learned about you when I was doing my bit of research is, and correct me if this is wrong, but you speak Irish and German. Is that correct?
So my friends edit my Wikipedia page, just so you know. So some things in there are either lies or exaggeration. So everybody who goes to school in Ireland speaks Irish, pretty much. You have to do it. It's a mandatory subject. And I used to be relatively fluent. I think I got like a B in my A levels, or leaving cert, A level equivalent. But now it's very rusty. So I would need probably a few days of conversation for it to come back. My German is acceptable. It's not fluent at all. So I have a German friend, and I was speaking German with his children, and they laugh because they think I speak like a toddler, basically. So I would be very able to, you know, handle the airport and check into a hotel and get a train and all the things you learn in school. But outside of that, no way.
Now, the only reason I brought that up was somebody else I was speaking to recently had said that they felt there was a good link between having a good mindset for STEM and learning multiple languages. So that's why I wanted to check that was right, to see what your take on that is, if
I
there is a good
I pick
mindset
up
for the two.
I pick up languages pretty quickly, but I think that's as much down to my memory as it is down to how my mind works. So, like, I am a one-trick pony. I have a very good memory. So I'm very good at learning sort of set pieces. That's why I'm very good at the things like checking into the airport, or any of that kind of stuff, because I learned it in school and it's stuck in my head. But if someone goes off the script, I'm in trouble. So I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but I'd like someone to do some research on it. I always think there's this stereotype of what scientists are like. And I think if you genuinely did across all the disciplines, if you did sort of surveys and checked people, I'd say you'd find a very wide range of people. Very, like, you're going to get more nerds than average because nerdy people like science. But like, I think you'll find, like, I've worked with people who are, one was the captain of the Oxford boat team. He's really athletic. I've worked with people who are musical, artistic, people like me who can't do any of those things. I've worked with classic introvert nerds, huge extroverts like me. I'm far from introverted. So I think it's bigger than that. I think people who like science like lots of things. They're not closed in like people think.
Okay. And that's actually a good time to ask the same question I ask all of my guests, which is, what advice would you give to children or young people who are maybe curious about STEM but aren't really sure where they can go with it or what to do with it?
Well, luckily now it's great for kids. There's tons of books, there's loads of TV shows. If you're really young, watch Operation Ouch. Operation Ouch is awesome. The BBC, it's on the BBC. The Van Tuckelen twins do it. It's really funny and it's a really good way to get into biology. There's loads of cool things on the BBC website, Bite Size, and look up things on YouTube. There's tons of experiments you can do that aren't dangerous. And there's other experiments, grow things, plant some seeds and see how they grow. You know, capture some insects and then let them go afterwards and have a look at them with a magnifying glass. Go to an aquarium, go to the Natural History Museum. There's loads of things you can do when you're young. And anything that interests you, that's the thing. You have to be interested in it. You have to want to know how it works. So if you find something that's interesting, don't let people think it's not a good thing to look at. If you're mad interested in the wings of butterflies or how telescopes work, then go with that. Just run away with it and see where it takes you. I think that creative sort of free flow idea that gets suppressed in a lot of science is a problem because we're so rigid and we want to make sure everything's done right and it's publishable and all that kind of thing, that we lose that creative side of it. And being creative and asking the right questions is key. So just ask questions and see where it leads you.
And anyone who's new to the STEM with Mr. N channel that's found it just because I'm interviewing Darragh, make sure and check out my experiment videos. They're on YouTube. So
Oh, cool.
good experiment videos there for you to do. Low cost, easy to do at home.
Yeah, exactly. And that's always the best way to start because it's cool and it's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and it can involve the whole family as well, which is nice. Now, obviously, I said all of this was going to be about your science things. I am going to mention a bit about the chase here, but only because of
Yes.
something I heard you saying on TikTok the other day. And I thought it might come up in that advice question because it was a video you'd done about when people ask you for advice, and you'd said something about just taking opportunities that come to you. If you can remember the video I'm talking about, would you
I
be able
can,
to
yeah, I can.
expand on that for us here?
Yeah, so I did all of this by accident. I didn't plan this. I know I said I wanted to be a biologist, but I kind of did it by accident. I ended up doing ecology. This is a bit of a long story, but it's got a point because my friend Nadine got sick. So Nadine was a really good friend of mine when I was in undergrad. And when I was in third year, on my summer holidays, one of my friends called me and said, listen, Nadine's got sick. She was meant to go on the ecology field trip. Do you want to go? I go, when is it? In the morning. I said, yeah, sure, why not? So I got some money together. I actually borrowed some money off my sister because I was broke. And I went away for a week to the west of Ireland on an ecology field trip with that was my mate Tom, who's still one of my best friends. And I absolutely loved it. Up until that point, I had no idea what modules I was doing in my final year. I didn't know what project I wanted to do. This was it for me. So I ended up doing that purely because my friend got the flu. Otherwise, I never would have done it. I did my PhD in the same lab, had a brilliant time, met my wife, went to Canada, worked there, came to the UK, had insect experience, ended up on TV. All that stuff happened because of a single instant that my friend Nadine caught the flu. And if she hadn't, my life would have changed. But that's just that happens every single day. So we talk about going back in the past, and this is what I mentioned in the video. If you go to a time travel movie, they go, don't change anything, don't stand on an ant, don't do anything because the chaos, the butterfly effect, don't go on a date with your mother, Marty McFly, because you'll disappear. We always think that's true if we travel back in time. But what about now? Your actions, even the smallest ones, can have huge repercussions. And you just don't know what they are. So don't ever think you're unimportant, that you're insignificant. Your little choices, the little thing that you do, can change everything. So always think about that. Never feel that you're nothing, that you're nobody, that what you do isn't important, because you literally never know. My friend Nadine bumping into someone who had the flu means that I'm on the chase 20 years later. And those two things are directly connected. It's a long line, but it's a direct connection. So yeah, that was it. It was the butterfly effect works without time travel.